good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whenever you may be tuning in to the Growing Our Future podcast. We always like to say that agriculture's taught us anything. It's taught us if you want to know what the future is, grow it. Well, to grow it, that means you got to plant seeds. And today we've got an exceptional guest, and I cannot wait for him to share words of wisdom, insights, experiences. He's going to share some seeds of greatness that if we plant them in our lives, trust me, nurture them, take care of them, they're going to grow into something beautiful. We are honored today to have Dan Owolabi. Dan, thank you for joining us.
It's good to be here. Very good to be here.
I don't know about y'all, but just look at Dan's smile. I mean, there's just something about it that's contagious. It's energetic. You're like, all right, I can't wait to talk to this guy.
That's great.
So, Dan, we're excited you're here. Okay, we start every podcast off with the same question. Dan, what are you grateful for today?
That's a good question. Gosh, if I was going to answer off the top of my head, I think I'm grateful for God's goodness. And I feel like there are so many things that I've been given to steward and so many opportunities that like being on this podcast that I didn't have to fight for. God sort of brought in my lap, and these are opportunities to share His goodness and experience His goodness. So I'm very thankful for that today, and that just encompasses a lot of things. But that's what comes to mind right now. That's
a big umbrella you just cast. That's a big. Think about that when you said God's goodness. When I think of leadership, and we won't drill down too much into this, but I think of that exactly what you just said. I've talked to leaders from all over the country, athletes, movie stars, politicians, and business executives, and I don't know that I could name one of them that gets up in the morning and makes their own heart beat.
That's good. That's right. That's right.
So when you say goodness, I think, man, you know what? Like Dan, you said something nobody else has ever said before. I like that. I've been given opportunities today to be responsible for something. I've been given a country that gives me the freedoms and liberties to be grateful, to choose what I want to eat, where I want to work, what jobs I want to have. The fact that I can disagree vocally or be a keyboard warrior, whichever one I can do.
It's all gift. That's right.
All of that's under that grace, that goodness, that beautiful gift that we've been given. Thank you for sharing that. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
Dan, tell us a little bit about, let's start off with the formalities. You're an author, you're a speaker, you're a trainer. You're kind of your genre, if you will, your niche is authentic leadership. Give us a little bit of that, and then I want to go back deeper into kind of how you got to there.
Yeah, absolutely. So you hit on a lot of things. First and foremost, I'm a husband. I've got a wife of 15 years. I've got two little girls, and love those guys. My main responsibility is to them. I'm an author, like you said, wrote a book a couple of years ago. It's been fun to watch that out in the wild, kind of changing lives. And you go to coffee shops and you see people reading your book. That's a humbling experience. I lead an international nonprofit where I work with leaders all over the world in 17 countries. And, that is very exciting. I mean, that's an opportunity to really change communities and transform lives around the world. So I'm proud to be able to lead that organization. It's called Branches Worldwide. And then, I do a lot of domestic leadership development. I work with CEOs and executives around the United States, really helping them maximize their influence and really become people who serve their communities in a way that makes people better. And so there's a lot of things that go with that, but I love doing that. And then I'm working on a doctorate in global leadership right now. So I got my hands full. There's a lot going on.
I got to sit through a young man's defense of his dissertation the other day for his doctoral. So I couldn't imagine what it would be like to do one of those on a global scale. So
it gives you a lot of perspective, and it's challenging in the best ways.
Do you have to speak any foreign language to do that? Or is it just, you can defend it in English only?
Yeah. Thank the Lord. Yeah. Just English. Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I suspect that you did not just fall into that seat right there. Something tells me that there was a journey. There were things that happened from childhood to today that put you in this position of influence, of leadership, of encouragement, empowerment. Dan, take us on that journey. Tell us how you ended in this position of executive director of branches worldwide and authentic leadership.
Yeah.
Tell us that story.
Yeah. I'll give you the short version. So, looking back on your life, it's much easier to see the patterns than, when you're looking ahead, right? You really can't see where you're headed. You can only connect the dots looking backwards. And when I connect the dots looking backwards, what I find is that everything I've been doing in my life really finds itself at the intersection of faith and leadership. Like that's where I find myself again and again and again. And the truth is, my mom and dad had a very unique experience, and that really connected to the way that I see the world today. So, just some background: my mom and dad were both Nigerian immigrants, came to the United States. My mom and dad are both deaf, meaning they couldn't hear. So I'm fluent in sign language, and so when I talk, you can see me. I use my hands a lot, because it's a natural reflex. But the reality is, growing up, and I talk about this in my book, there was a tremendous amount of insecurity from having such a different background. The community that we grew up in was an all-white community. We were the only Black family. We were for sure the only family with deaf people in it, right? So there's another level. It was a small town. I graduated with 80 kids in my class. So just real small. And what happens is, you become known as the kid with deaf parents, like the Black kid with deaf parents. Like that's who you are. And I just fought against that. Like I really wanted to be known as someone else. And so really what I learned in those seasons as I was growing up is just what it feels like to constantly feel like you have to prove yourself. Like you're always trying to hide your background and you always have something to lose. You don't want people to look at you a certain way. And when I start talking about authentic leadership, the tagline is how to lead with nothing to hide, nothing to prove, and nothing to lose. And what I found over the course of 20 years of, just sort of, not just growing up, I mean, that was one experience, but then every other season of my life, what I found was that if you lead in the direction of serving, like if you try your best to really position yourself to serve the people around you, suddenly what you find is that you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to prove, and you have nothing to lose because it's not about you. Like you're there to make their life better. And all of a sudden, where insecurity might be a presence in your life, it just disappears. So in the work I do then with executives, CEOs, entrepreneurs around the world right now, you find that people at these high levels, if you peel back the layers, you look behind the curtain, in their quiet moments, they are incredibly insecure people who feel like they constantly have to prove themselves and they constantly have to present this front as if they have it all together. And the reality is, what we do is we really help them sort of peel back that and say, you know what, I'm just here to serve. Come hell or high water, I'm just here to serve. Nothing to hide, nothing to prove, nothing to lose. And then they actually become more productive because they're not constantly fighting themselves and their own insecurity.
Wow. That's good stuff. That hide, what was the second one?
Yep. Nothing to hide, nothing to prove, and nothing to lose.
Nothing to lose. That's right. I had those two flipped around. Nothing to lose. As I go through these podcasts, I'm always listening. What's going to be the name of this podcast? So you said about 3 or 4 things in that last segment there that could have been really good tags. I guess what kind of came to my mind, I just throw this out there, is I think of cognitive dissonance, that concept of holding 2 conflicting thoughts in the mind at one time. And when you described what you just described about that insecurity is, wait, I'm the boss. I'm supposed to be here. But because I've got this little hiccup here, I'm really down here.
Right.
And I always tell people that little chasm right there, that little chasm is called stress.
Oh, yeah. That's good. That's
Am I
really
right?
good. You're 100% right. Oh, my goodness. You call it stress. I'll call it, and it's this exact same thing. I call it the insecurity gap. There's actually a name for it. It's where the person of who you are and then who people think you are aren't together. And there's this gap. And so you constantly feel like every time you walk into a room, people think you're this, but you're really this. And suddenly people are like, you get insecure because you're like, I have to keep projecting, I have to act like something I'm not, I have to answer questions I know I don't have answers for. that causes stress. And I would say, that if you break it down, that's stress, but that's also worry, that's also fear, that's
Right.
also anxiety. And when you feel sort of overwhelming amounts of those things, you can go directly back to that insecurity gap and say, hey, look, I'm actually trying to project myself to be more than I am. That's why I'm feeling these feelings right now.
I had a gentleman that worked for me. I used to be, before I took this job, I was executive director of Turning Point, which was the North Texas Council on Substance Abuse. And we worked with at-risk populations in eight counties. And I wasn't hired because I had any expertise there. I was hired to help with some management issues. But God put me there for a reason, because I learned a lot. I learned a lot about people. Interestingly enough, I've been in this job for 22 years, but I actually came to Austin to turn this job down because I enjoyed working with the boot camp kids and the truant offenders and the at-risk families. And I was doing programs in the prison because my background, I could relate to that. I wanted to give back because I could connect to that. But I say all that to say this: one day, my coworker, who was a professional counselor, he could tell that I was stressed. And I told him why. And I said, Steve, we got to get this done and this done, and we got to get all this stuff done. He goes, Aaron, he goes, you're the only one that put the bar up there.
Mm.
He goes, nobody else sees that.
Mm.
He goes, Aaron, you can move that bar down.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you that advice, just like the way you're couching your authentic leadership presentation, it's not that it's lowering the productivity. As a matter of fact, to your point, I believe it's increasing the productivity because it's reducing those hangups, those anxiety bubbles, those stresses that prevent us from, holding those two thoughts in mind. And when Steve said that, it's like the light bulb came on. It's, I tell people, I ask people, I said, have many of you ever tried to drive your car with the emergency brake on? And everybody always jokes and laughs and says, yeah. And I said, yeah. So what happens when the emergency brake's on? Well, we give it more gas. What's wrong with this thing?
Mm.
Somewhere along the way, you look down and you go, well, your emergency brake's on, you big dummy. And you take the emergency brake off and the car does what it's designed to do.
With half the effort.
And I think, Dan, that's what you're bringing to CEOs. That's what you're bringing to FFA members. That's what you're bringing to young people around the world, is that hope, that understanding of you were created for greatness. You were designed for excellence. You don't have to give it more gas.
That's right.
Sometimes you just got to look around and have somebody help you take that emergency brake off.
That's right. That's exactly right. I love that analogy. That's strong, Aaron. And I think, to go back to the original point, I think there's moments when you recognize that you have the emergency brake on, and it takes someone from the outside to really sort of step in and say, hey, look, or, the one guy who stepped in and said, hey, look, you can lower the bar. Really what he's probably saying was, hey, look, you're here to serve people. You're not here to create some sort of like magical thing and some sort of standard that really only exists in your head. You're here to meet the needs of these people, and that is enough. So like lean into that. Like that's the kind of emergency brake that he released for you. I think that's 100% correct.
That's awesome. And you're right. We have a program. One of these days, I'm hopeful you're going to be able to come to the Texas FFA convention. It's the largest youth-led convention in the state. There's last year, I think, 15,680 kids for a whole week on stage. I mean, it's fascinating. But we have a program called the Foundation Ambassadors, and these are 70 kids that work for us at the foundation, and they take care of all of our guests and all of our special guests that come to convention. And we have a couple of sayings that we use around our shop. Number one, the essence of leadership is to plant trees under whose shade you may never sit. We want them to understand that really what we're here for is to do things that might benefit my grandchildren one day or their grandchildren one day. And the other one is that, when your values are clear, your choices are easy. But we couch those two statements under this. I tell them, I said, when you get into high school, it's real easy to take. You do fundraisers, buy my fruit, buy my sausage, buy my animal, buy my candle, buy my cookie dough. give me that scholarship. And when you get to college, you might be able to do a little bit more of that, maybe. But when you get out of college, the world's going to change a lot. And there's going to be a lot less taking that can take place. But if when you're in high school, you can learn to serve, look for a need, guess what? When you go to college, guess what you can do? You can serve and you can look for a need. And one day when you get out and you got a job and you can move into a community, guess what you can do? And I believe, and I'm sure this is all part of your seminars and your planning, but I believe there's a lot of happiness that comes in serving.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. I think service oftentimes is the most underrated superpower, because I think people who recognize that they're put on earth to meet needs of other people, they recognize that sense of joy, and they want to do it more, especially when they're using the talent that they've naturally developed. And, so really it becomes about, positioning themselves to serve other people with excellence in a way that makes them come alive and makes other people come alive. There's no insecurity there. There's no like climbing a ladder or trying to, compete with other people. You're really just here to make the world a better place. And that gives you a ton of joy. You can find that early. Gosh, goodness, you have a lot of fun. The world gets better and everything works together.
Your whole view of things changes, because to your point, then you're not looking in here. You're looking out here.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Well, we could take off on this one. Trust me, we could spend an hour just on this topic alone. But I do very much value and appreciate the fact that you're empowering people to recognize that element of service, which I love the term servant leadership. I love the term authentic leadership, genuinely authentic. I love all of those ways of describing, serving others.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, authentic leadership for me is really about positioning yourself to be the best version of yourself in the service of other people. And so, I love Robert Greenleaf. I love the idea of servant leadership. Like, that whole concept is great. Jesus is a great example of that. There's other leaders around the world in history that are good examples of that. But I think, where authentic leadership comes in for me is it goes beyond just serving people and a posture of service, but it goes into your sort of internal sense of self-efficacy, like that you are good enough to be a leader. It really kind of hits that idea of insecurity really hard, because I think oftentimes when people say, hey, I want to be a servant leader, they're like, look, I'm just going to find like the smallest position in the smallest organization, and I'm going to, just sort of do everything I can and just sort of stay under the radar. But I think what authentic leadership does is it says, look, no, you've been given gifts and talents. And if you're in a position where you can actually make a difference, don't shy away from that. Step into the spotlight and be the best version of yourself, but do it for the sake of other people. So push yourself hard, like do everything you can to really maximize the talent that you've been given, but always keep in mind that everything you've been given is for the sake of other people, right? When you have those two things together, you feeling like, hey, I've been put on this earth to really just change things and make things better, but not for myself, for other people, suddenly you have a powerhouse leader. Like, those people are grounded. Like, there's no illusions, there's no posturing, they get to know you personally. At the same time, they're going to push you. They're the people who want to change the world and also change your life at the same time.
One of my early mentors, I grew up at a boys ranch. And growing up at that boys ranch, I didn't have necessarily father figures. I mean, I had people in my life that made me better. I had bosses and expectations. And my dorm parent, his name was Mr. Chandler. My oldest son is named Chandler. So there's a little bit of influence there, right? But a friend of mine gave me a copy of a book by Zig Ziglar called See You at the Top.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the early quotes in that book that have really helped guide a lot of my actions in life and attitudes and cultural development is the one statement that Zig said when he said, if you help enough other people get what they want, you'll get what you want. So I was very fortunate that early on in my life, I adopted a value system of help other people.
Yeah.
Somebody helped you. You're not out here at Boys Ranch because the government gave them all this money. You're out here because somebody donated this money. You're out here because somebody wanted to give you a second chance. Now, your responsibility is to go out there and do something better for somebody else.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And what that does, Aaron, is that positions you in a position of gratitude. As you're serving other people, you are always thinking back to how people helped you. And you're just thankful. So when somebody gives you a hard time or it's a tough day, you're like, you know what? I'm sure I gave somebody a hard time. I'm sure I made somebody's day really tough. And you're just in a position of gratitude. You're like, you know what? Thank you for their patience in my life. I can turn around and pass that forward. Going back to the point you made earlier, you're planting seeds in which you might never actually experience the shade. Like you're passing that forward. They might not be nice to you, but you're nice to them knowing someone was nice to you, right? That's what you're saying.
I like to be nice to them just because it makes them matter.
That's good. I love it.
That's Tom Ziegler, who I hope you get to meet when you're in Texas next. But Tom Ziegler's on our board, and Tom and I have a lot of these conversations. And he was telling me recently where he was up speaking to some students on the East Coast in this college group, and he asked them about that gratitude. He talked about gratitude, and he asked them, what is the opposite of gratitude? And the class got quiet, and they're thinking about it. And finally, he said, the opposite of gratitude is entitlement. And then what you do is then you begin to dissect and capture the emotions around these two, gratefulness and entitlement. So when you're grateful, you feel hopeful, you feel energized, you feel comfortable, you feel happy. But when you go to a space of that's not fair, that's mine, give that to me. Your attitude completely changes in that process to something completely different.
Right.
And when I think about what you said earlier about the role that we play in other people's lives, I think there's a real nugget of gold there in what you shared. And that is, if you're that grateful person, we're that hopeful person for somebody else. But if you're that angry person, you're only confirming for them what they see in the news, on social media, in the ether, which I don't believe is the majority.
I would agree. And I think that's a really good point you're making, Aaron. I think you could take any subset of people in the United States or around the world, and there's a caricature of them as an entitled person. Like, oh, it's an entitled moms, dads, kids, minorities, CEOs. You can point to a picture of them somewhere in the news of them being entitled. And I think oftentimes we take the worst version of people and we're like, well, they're just an entitled so-and-so. Well, the other side of it, exactly right, is gratitude. And any one of those individuals or anybody in society, when they position themselves with a heart of gratitude, suddenly they become a real blessing to everybody around them. They are just glad to be here. They know that they have no expectations on anyone. They're just glad to help, glad to be part of it, and if it goes wrong, hey, that's fine, we'll make it better. But there's no sense of like an injustice has happened to them. They're like, hey, I didn't expect it to be perfect. And so therefore I'm just glad to make it better and just lend a hand,
Yeah, I was talking to a group the other day and we got into this discussion of some of the social challenges of our day. And I said, well, how come y'all are leaving me out? And they looked at me and they said, what do you mean we're leaving you out? I said, y'all said nothing about short people. I said, and it's just a pause to understand that when we go down that path, where does it ever end? Unless I can just look and say, man, I'm glad I wasn't as tall as somebody else. It's like you said, you just got to kind of put it into a perspective. Do I want to be a blessing to others or a burden to others? Do I want to be that person that walks in the room and brightens it up, or that guy that leaves the room to brighten it up?
That's right. And everybody has a choice. You've got an opportunity to choose. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, that's what this podcast is for. one of my favorite quotes, I use this quote across the country when I have an opportunity to make presentations, and they attribute it to Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln said that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will become the philosophy of government in the next.
That's right. Yeah.
And so when I think about the Growing Our Future podcast, that's the reason why I liken it to agriculture, because we want to bring on guests like you, guests that are high energy, guests that are visionary, guests that want to make the world better. And we bring on some subject matter experts that have technical expertise. We bring on some that have political expertise or organizational expertise. And then we bring on folks that bring leadership expertise. And I think that's kind of one of the things that you bring to the table today is you're bringing this core value of leadership, this core value of authentic leadership.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing that I'm excited by. I think you're right. The Growing the Future podcast is key because it's everything you're saying. I mean, if you want to know what the future is, you've got to grow it. You've got to make it happen. And I think the reality is nothing changes in the future without leadership, like for good or bad, nothing changes. And you go to any community in any place, any country around the world, you'll find one common denominator. That's leadership. Like somebody is leading in every season, whether they're a good leader or a bad leader, that's up for grabs. And so for me, when you talk about the sort of the practice of leadership, the practice of authentic leadership, it's a real passion of mine, because if we can get enough people to understand what you're trying to say about servant leadership and enough people to understand what I'm trying to say about authentic leadership, suddenly the future looks much, much brighter in every domain.
Absolutely.
Right? In science and agriculture and government and schools, like everything gets better because you have the right leaders in the right spots. But you're going to have leaders in those spots, right? We get an opportunity to decide and to kind of help shape what those leaders look like because we make those intentional choices today. So I love what you're doing. I think it makes a ton of sense.
One of the things that I like that you've said, and Dan, when we started this, I told you that there's not a prescribed set of questions. And the reason I say that is because I think people find the greatest takeaways in somebody's testimony. I think by letting people tell their story of where they've been and how they got there, there's somebody listening that they were put there in that seat to hear that story for a specific reason. So I do believe that. But I believe as leaders, we have a responsibility. I'll throw this out at you, and I'm just curious your thoughts. I don't know how big Friday night football is there in Ohio, but I can tell you in the great state of Texas, Friday night football is a big deal. And so I remember going to a Friday night football game, and there were 7 coaches on the sideline. At halftime, 3 more coaches came out of the press box. And then I found out there were 3 more coaches that were out scouting other teams for upcoming games. Now, let's put that in perspective. That's 13 coaches for what? To compete on a field for one night of one season of somebody's life. They've got their whole life ahead of them. My question is, what are we doing to compete for their minds? What are we doing to step up and say, can I have some of your attention so I can share with you these incredible core values of authentic leadership? And so what I worry about sometimes as leaders is if we're not willing to put a game plan together to compete for minds, maybe somebody else already has.
Yeah, that's it. You're hitting on it. Yeah. It's not like there's some sort of vacuum out there where, no one is trying to compete for the minds of our kids in the future or, our own attention in the future. People are doing it. The key for us is to be the best at it. And so people are going to be led. The question is, are we in the mix trying to lead people in the right direction? I love that because Friday Night Football is big in Ohio too. And it is not hard to get thousands of people to show up on a Friday to watch high schoolers, hit each other. But I think, one of the things I learned, I used to coach for a little bit. One of the things I learned is that those moments can be incredible vehicles to communicate, just like you said, core values, real beliefs and values that will transcend football. I think giving people an opportunity to show up and kind of play the game is one thing. But if you can teach them something deeper while they're doing it, come on now. Like people will do that faster than they'll do it in a classroom or something like that. So I love what you're saying. And I think there's opportunity all over the place.
So shout out to my neighbor. So my kids all grew up in the same age groups as one of my next door neighbors who we're very dear friends with. Well, one of those young men that grew up with my kids is kind of an icon there in your state of Ohio. He was the Big Ten. He broke every Big Ten record. J.T. Barrett, the quarterback at Ohio State University,
Oh, wow.
was our next door neighbor.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, to your point, I got to watch a young man grow up in the neighborhood throwing baseballs, basketballs, footballs. But I also got to watch that young man talk about leadership.
Mm.
So to your point, that was just another vehicle for him to develop those leadership traits. And he had people that were investing in him, competing for his mind, not just his talent.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
Planting seeds that would grow trees, or giving him the seeds that are going to be planted in the future.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
So that's the beauty.
And you can see, I don't know much about JT, but you can see the future based on the way that he handled the past, right? You can see who he is now directly connected to who he was then, the people in his life then. And so that's 100% along with the lines of what you're saying. How he stewarded those moments and those individuals in his life are directly changing his life today.
Like I said, you and I could talk for hours. Okay, let me pull us back in a little bit. Here we go. Give me 3 leadership traits. If I'm a student listening right now, I'm an ag teacher, I'm a sponsor, I'm somebody that's listening right now. What is Dan Owolabi's best 3 tips on becoming an effective leader?
Goodness, best 3 tips. All right, so yeah, let me give it to you. I think best 3. So I think the first one has to do with you. So you have to lead yourself. That's the very first one. Like if you can't lead yourself, you can't lead anybody. And when I say that, I mean that's self-awareness, right? Like recognizing what you're feeling in a moment, right? Not getting like hijacked by your own feelings. Also recognizing how people respond to you when you walk in a room, right? Self-awareness has 2 different sides to it. So, how do I feel about myself and how do other people look at me? So you're very self-aware. That's part of leading yourself. You do the hard work of leadership, meaning, you're not trying to mail it in. You're not trying to guess. Like you actually know what you're talking about. If you read the book and it didn't make any sense, read it twice. Like read it again. Like you do the hard work, and so there's no pretending that you know what you're talking about. You actually know what you're talking about when it comes to the subject you're in, science or ag or really anything. Like you know what you're talking about. You're an expert in it. So I would say leading yourself, like that discipline, keeping promises that you make to yourself, that kind of thing. That's really key. That's number 1, leading yourself. I think number 2, understanding other people. That's oftentimes where people you miss out. We were in a conversation, Aaron, a little bit earlier before we started recording, and we were talking about cultural differences. And you gave 2 great stories of how you were curious about other people who are of a different cultural background than you. And you leaned in and you asked questions without judgment. You just said, hey, tell me more about this. Tell me more about that. All in an effort to understand other people. I think oftentimes we make judgments of people way too quickly before we know the whole story. And we assume, hey, I know this guy, and we just label people and jump to conclusions. The best leaders really take the time to understand people and understand how they're different. And more importantly, why they're different. Oh, you know what? If I was them and I had the background that they did, I would probably come to the same conclusions. Even though I don't agree with them, I get why they're thinking the way they're thinking.
Right.
Okay. So those are the first 2 things, like lead yourself and then understand other people. Like that's key. And then the final thing is really about vision. I think people really want leaders who are willing to paint a clear vision of the future and then paint a picture of how they can fit into that. I think oftentimes when we think about leadership, we're thinking about people who can, they can climb the ladder on their own. They can get stuff done on their own. That's fine. I learned this when I was in college. I played college basketball, right? And, in high school, if you lead yourself, that's like 90% of it. Like if you know how to wake up early, shoot free throws, you know how to run, win sprints. If you can push yourself, then everyone thinks you're a leader because you can score points. That's really all you got to do. When I got to college, I realized that everybody works hard. Like it's not enough to be a hard worker. Like everybody is in the weight room at 3 a.m. Like everybody is. So whatever competitive advantage you thought you had is gone now. And the real competitive advantage is legit leadership, like your ability to paint a picture of what you think the team can do, and then get everyone to be part of that and say, hey, post players, here's what you can do, and point guards, here's how you fit in, and getting everybody involved and being the type of leader that when you walk in the room, people are like, I want to follow that guy, or I want to follow that girl because she cares about me and she has a vision for my future and the future of the team, sort of all wrapped in one. So if you're able to do that, if you're able to lead yourself, right, you've demonstrated you can do the hard work, you show up on time, you know how to do all that work. But then on the other side, you understand people, you know their buttons, you can understand their cultural background, you know who they are as people, you really are curious about them. And then finally, you paint a picture of the future, how they could be part of it, one that's compelling, that gets people excited. If you can do all three of those things together, watch out. Watch out. I mean, you're a legit leader. You know what you're doing.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's why I love this podcast right there. You bring people on that share their heart, they share their testimony, they share their story, and it never fails. Somewhere in their journey, their experiences, their expertise, they share incredible seeds of greatness, things that we can put in our lives to make us become those better leaders, those better husbands, those better brothers and sisters, those better community members, all of those things, because somebody was willing to share those things. And we showed up to get them. I know not everybody's going to tune into this. I get it. But the ones that tuned in to hear that message that Dan Owolabi brought today, they're the ones that need to hear that message. So open up those ears today if you were that person, because the wisdom that was shared today was shared for a reason. It was to plant trees and to grow a great future. All right. Well, Dan, we better wrap up because, again, I think I could just keep talking to you for the rest of the day. And I know you
This is fun.
Important things to do around the world and locally and domestically. But you do get one last question. We always have one question at the end of every podcast that's kind of a fun question. What is the best concert you've ever been to?
No, the best concert I've ever been to. Oh, goodness. You know what? I am not really much of a concert person, but the best concert I went to was one where I had to travel, oh, goodness, probably 17 hours to get to. Yeah, it was, I'll tell you what it was. So I was in Nigeria, and I was working with a leader there, and we were kind of talking and stuff. And by the time our time was over, I had to say goodbye. And I knew that I had, oh goodness, I probably had 15 hours, 17 hours to get to that concert. And so I got on a plane, like flew across the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, I was going to be late too if I didn't hurry. So I flew across the Atlantic Ocean, made my connecting flight in Atlanta, took the flight from Atlanta to Cleveland is where I live, got in the car, drove an hour to get to the concert. I run in, and the concert was for my 7-year-old daughter. She had just a little girls concert. I mean, it was like first graders, they're all in there. She had a little part in it. And I got there right in time for her one part, right? But being a dad is like one of the most important things to me. And so I wanted her to know that I was willing to drop everything in Nigeria, fly across the world, like speed. Once I left the airport, I'm running through the airport with my bags. I get to my car, I'm speeding to get to her concert. And then once we get there, I sit down and she sees me and waves, right before. I haven't showered yet. I'm smelly, But if you ask about my favorite concert I've been to, it was that one. I don't think I've ever sacrificed as much to be at her concert right there. So that would be the one.
Well, I don't know how many interviews I'll, be blessed with in my lifetime, but that's going to be one, if not the most cherished stories I've heard yet. That's incredible, and I appreciate you sharing that on a number of levels. That's an incredible story. One of my board members and I, we always say the right thing is always the right thing.
That's good. That's good.
That right there's an example of that. We definitely, within the culture of the foundation and the folks that we deal with, we're definitely a family first environment. So that's a beautiful story. Dan, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. Again, we've worked to schedule this because this is a busy man, and we're fortunate that he shared some of his time, talent, treasures, and testimony with us today. And we're excited that for those that don't know, we're making some introductions to Dan into the Texas FFA leadership training programs. And I think you can see why I personally am so excited to see Dan coming into the mix. And I just know that it's going to help us grow the kind of futures we want. For all of our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. It's always a pleasure to bring the Growing Our Future podcast to you. It's always a pleasure to bring on subject matter experts and people that are willing to share, to serve, and authentically give to others. And Dan was no different today. He shared an incredible testimony, words of wisdom, insights, and just nuggets of gold. So until our paths cross again, go out and do something extraordinary for somebody else. And remember, if you want to know what the future is, grow it. That means you got to plant those seeds. You got to nurture them, take care of them, and grow that bountiful harvest. Everybody be safe until we meet again. Thank you for joining us.